Relief. Most of them were bearing up just fine, Ferrell thought. They could easily take another few months at the Boundary, even a year. The exception was young Keelan, whose sobbing, muffled as best he could manage with a thin blanket, was becoming a regular nocturnal occurrence. Nobody mentioned it, least of all Keelan, who during his watch displayed the false bravado typical of a young soldier trying to fit in with his elders. But they all knew that this posting was taking its toll on the lad's mind. Every time he woke, his eyes would stray to the board mounted on the wall next to the barracks door, which held 300 short wooden pegs in 300 holes. Each peg was painted black at one end, white at the other. When they had arrived, Keelan, as the youngest member, was given the job of turning each peg so that the black end faced outwards. Each dawn, whoever was on watch turned one peg to show its white end. Thus their days at the Boundary were counted. The door swung open, spilling the orange dawn light across the rough wooden planks of the floor. Darrick entered, set his burnished helm on the table and nodded to the others. Most were awake, except Brissin, whose infamous snoring rose from his bunk at the far end of the room. His watch had ended just 4 hours ago. Darrick blew a strong sigh through his moustache and glanced at Keelan, sat on the edge of his cot, whose gaze had landed once again on the pegs. "Want to take care of that for me, lad?" Darrick asked in a soft voice. He, more than any of the others, had taken the young soldier under his wing, though never to the point of outright comfort. Keelan's pride would never have permitted that. Keelan regarded the older man quietly for a moment, then rose to his feet and pushed his loose black hair out of his face. He approached the board, reverently removed the black peg, turned it, and replaced it in the slot. Every peg on the board now showed its white face to the barracks. Keelan heaved a silent sigh, but they all saw it in his shoulders, sagging in relief. Ferrell and Darrick shared a glance. "Fresh boots will be here in a couple of hours," Ferrell declared, easing himself to his feet. "Let's get packed up and put the place in some kind of order." The barracks shook with a rumble. "And someone go wake Brissin." Ferrell stamped his boots in the dew-laden grass outside the barracks and stretched his taut muscles. The air was cool, moving lazily down from the mountains to the southeast, but the sun warmed his aches. He looked to the west, to the isthmus where the Boundary wall stood glowing in the reflected light of morning. He could see Teague leaning on his spear and Brandon patrolling towards the northern end. 2 small plumes of smoke rose from the foot of the wall on the western side. A quiet night, then. "Think Blue Eyes is awake?" Keelan asked, emerging from the barracks. "Do wizards even need sleep?" Ferrell responded. "Ours seemed to be reading his books whatever time of day or night you went to see him." "Ours did little else but sleep," Keelan scoffed. "But he was pretty old by that point. He's probably retired by now," he mused. "I'll go check upstairs." There were many theories as to why the vast majority of council-appointed wizards resided in towers. Some of the more embittered ones suggested it was because they felt the need to elevate themselves above the rest of the populace, while more generous assessments claimed the higher they were, the clearer their connection to the gods. In any case, the wizards stationed at the Boundary had little choice in the matter, as their assigned chambers were in the top of a purpose-built tower, opposite the barracks. Ferrell crossed the yard, hailing Arlen on the way, who was tending to the pair of chestnut geldings in the stable. Soon there would be another 13 horses joining them when the relief column arrived, and these too would see the end of their stay at the Boundary, replaced by 2 from the city. They seemed restless, as if they knew about the journey ahead of them and were keen to be off. The heavy door to the wizard's tower swung open easily, revealing the foot of the spiral stairs ascending into the gloom above, the only windows in the tower being at the top. Ferrell left the door open. He'd not be here long anyway, to light his way, but by the time he had made the first full turn he was almost blind, feeling his way up the steps. One uneven step caught the toe of his boot and he lost his balance, stumbling forward and swearing softly. As he righted himself and continued on, a voice came from above him. "Foss." The word was uttered quietly, but with a tone of command unmistakable to the ear of a soldier. A moment later, the stairwell was filled with a sourceless light, and Ferrell's remaining climb was swift and unhindered. "My thanks, Aelfred," he greeted the wizard upon entering the chamber at the tower's peak. It was a humble enough affair, though he had heard tales of wizards appointed here bringing an inordinate amount of home comforts with them. A large bed was set against the wall opposite a modest fireplace, glowing with the embers of the previous night's fire. A desk sat beneath the open western window, cluttered with papers and unfathomable instruments. The eastern window was closed but not shuttered, allowing the growing light of day to fill the room. "Nothing to it, Sergeant." The wizard waved a hand from where he sat at the desk. "I'd keep the stairs lit if it didn't require some concentration to maintain the spell." He turned from his notes and regarded the soldier with an appraising eye. This eye, along with its companion, was a pale icy blue, as the eyes of all wizards were. It was a change that came upon them at that young age when most bodily changes do. This particular wizard was far from that age now, the years showing in the grey of his hair and wrinkled features, but his eyes were always shining with that gleam peculiar to the young at heart. "What brings you here this morning, Sergeant?" he asked. Ferrell was a little taken aback. Aelfrid must know it was the day they all left for the city, yet now he thought about it, none of the wizard's belongings were packed. Had he forgotten? "I came to ask what help you needed getting your gear down to the stables, but—" He trailed off, looking about the room. "Oh, I didn't tell you?" The wizard's face wrinkled in confusion. "I was sure I told you. Or maybe I just meant to tell you, then thought I had." He shook his head as if to clear it. "I'm not coming." You're not... What?" Ferrell was truly perplexed now. Every company had a dozen soldiers and one wizard. They arrived at the Boundary together, they served their watch together, and when their relief column arrived 300 days later, they returned together. "I'm not coming," Aelfrid repeated. "I sent word to the council a couple of weeks ago requesting leave to remain for the duration of the next company's watch. I have work here I cannot leave unfinished." "Work you can't take with you back to the city?" Ferrell asked. He was not challenging the decision as such, just puzzled by it. Why anyone would choose to stay at the Boundary when it was their time to be relieved was beyond him. He was not one to question wizards. Their motivations were always a little mysterious, but as far as he knew, this would be unprecedented. "The work I refer to can be done nowhere else so easily as here." His eyes strayed to the open window, when something caught his eye and he stood for a better view. He beckoned Ferrell closer. "Look, here's another." Ferrell looked. In the distance, beyond the Boundary wall, a tiny figure was approaching. Teague and Brandon watched it as it drew closer. "What am I looking for?" Ferrell asked. The wizard raised his hand and swept it in an arc over the window frame. "May it uno." Ferrell stumbled back from the window as the ground beyond the wall suddenly rushed towards him. Aelfrid had the good grace to look contrite. "My apologies, Sergeant. I forget the effect that spell can have on the unprepared. Come, it's perfectly safe." Ferrell approached the window once more and looked. It was as if the window had moved and now stood just a spear's throw from the approaching figure. Shaking off his discomfiture, he watched. It was a woman, or had been. Its skin was grey and sloughing off in places, its eyes milky and empty. It walked slowly but steadily, with a slight limp. It was dressed in a loose-fitting linen shift, and held a heavy club loosely in its right hand. "Have you ever seen one so close?" Aelfrid asked. Ferrell nodded. "A few times, which was a few times too many." "Hold on, I'm going to move the view again." This time he moved his hands out, then towards himself. "O piso." Now the window seemed to be positioned just behind the wall, and Ferrell felt like he could reach out and tap his fellow soldiers on the back. They had drawn closer together now, and Teague had readied his bow, nocking an arrow, pulling it to full draw in a strong, smooth movement. Brandon carried something heavy in his right hand, out of sight below the window frame. "Hold," muttered Ferrell, his sergeant's instincts asserting themselves. "Hold." The woman was well within bowshot, but Teague waited for her to get closer, as they had been trained to do. Those whose nerves got the better of them, causing them to shoot too early, rarely made the same mistake twice, as it entailed venturing beyond the wall into the ashland of the isthmus. Teague's bowstring thrummed, the arrow flew straight and true and hit its mark with a sickening wet crunch. The approaching woman fell onto her back, hands plucking at the fletching sticking out of her forehead. A low moan came from her throat, the kind of moan that haunted the memories of all who had served their time at the Boundary. Before she could struggle back to her feet, Brandon had thrown his load from the wall, the flame tracing a graceful arc of smoke towards the downed foe. The lit jar shattered on contact, hitting her square on the chest and dousing her in pitch. The scream she emitted as she burned was all too chillingly human. Ferrell looked away. When he looked back, the window was displaying its normal, distant view of the wall. A fresh plume of black smoke rose beyond it. Why are wizards stationed at the boundary? Aelfrid asked rhetorically. It was a tone of voice that Ferrel's own town wizard would use when giving lessons, and Ferrel knew he was not seeking an answer, but would rather provide his own. Of course, we are here to provide any magical support the soldiers need, but more than that, we are here to study the phenomenon of the restless and seek answers. Why do the dead rise 4 days after they fall? Why do they attack the living, even those they knew and loved? Why do the Westerns send their dead against us, rather than burning them as we do? Why do the dead walk the ashlands of the Isthmus, rather than turn on the Westerns themselves? These are the questions that vex the council, and which the wizards stationed at the boundary are tasked to investigate. Aelfrid gazed out of the window once more, beyond the wall, beyond the ashlands, beyond the hills, into the heart of the western lands. I feel I am close to knowing some, if not all, of the mystery, he murmured quietly, as if to himself. Though it is the way of such questions, when answered, to beget more.